So the title, the Synod on Synodality and Ecumenical Perspective, is, I questioned, I guess, how to write that phrase, whether it's ecumenism and synodality or what, but this is what we came up with. And I'm hoping that makes sense. I can't speak for all of the ecumenical perspectives, but this is one. The brief outline of what I'm going to talk about today, a little bit about the intersection of ecumenism and synodality, and then some ecumenical experiences around what we call the ecumenical gift exchange, receptive ecumenism, and then I want to talk about synodality as it's practiced in other Christian communities, and how synodality appears in some of the ecumenical dialogues. It's 20 minutes. We'll try to cover all of that pretty quickly. This photo here is a photo from last September, the day before the Synod began. There was an ecumenical service in St. Peter's Square. It was part of a project called Together, the Gathering of the People of God. So at this ecumenical service, you obviously see Pope Francis. Beside him is Archbishop Justin Welby from the Anglican Communion, Anna Burkhardt, who is from the Lutheran World Federation, a fellow, I'm not actually sure who he is. He's the representative from the Ecumenical Patriarchate. That's the Greek Orthodox. And then there are other Methodist and Baptist and people from the the World Evangelical Alliance and various other groups. There's a huge ecumenical delegation behind them as well. At the beginning of that service, one of the organizers, introducing the theme of the service, said this. So this isn't from one of the leaders. This is one of the, I think it's the person who drafted this is part of the Synod organizing team as well. It said, "There is no synodality without ecumenism, and no ecumenism without synodality. Both are rooted in the baptismal dignity of the entire people of God. Together, they invite renewed commitment to the vision of a missionary synodal church. They are spiritual processes of repentance, forgiveness, and reconciliation in a dialogue of conversion that can lead us to a healing of memories." Now, when I heard that, I sat up straight. This was in a summary form, a wonderful outline of what we are doing as ecumenists, what we are trying to do, all the different themes of ecumenism coming out here. So let me go through that. These are the 5 themes that I picked out of that quote. First, that both synodality and ecumenism are rooted in baptism. In fact, it shouldn't be a surprise. These are both the discussion about synodality and the ecumenical discussion both come out of the Second Vatican Council in its discussion about the nature of the church in Lumen Gentium. As we talk about ecclesiology, and the fundamental focus of our ecclesiology is baptism and being rooted in baptism. We are the whole people of God. This is why we can, as Catholics, recognize other Christians as Christian, because we share a common baptism, and that is the foundation of every other ecumenical principle that comes from that. But it is also the same foundation for our synodal practice as a people of God, gathered together in our common reflections on and discernment on the future of the church and on the mission of Christ that we are engaged in. So rooted in baptism is a key element here. The missionary synodal church, the reference to these other 4 points, I'll go through a little bit faster. Obviously, we hear in many of the discussions about synod a strong focus on the missionary character of the church, of our engagement in the work of the church, the mission of Christ to build the kingdom of God. this is language that is also found frequently within the ecumenical discussions, both in dialogues and in other ecumenical theology. A strong missional focus and a strong focus on ecclesiology and the nature of the church. The heart of the ecumenical movement is what we call spiritual ecumenism. This brings our focus not just onto prayer and opportunities like the Week of Prayer for Christian Unity or other times when we may pray together with other Christians, but also to these spiritual processes focusing on repentance, forgiveness, and reconciliation within to reconcile memories, the healing of memories, and the last point. How, for example, as we talk to Mennonites, can we heal the memories of the 16th century martyrdom of Mennonites at the hands of Catholics? That continues to be a focus of the discussion and the dialogue between Mennonites and Catholics. But we have a wonderful resource and a dialogue called To Be Peacemakers, where we share that common task as Christian communities to be peacemakers, and we learn from Mennonites about their pacifist and nonviolent tradition, but we also speak about how do we heal those memories of our past and our history by transforming them and turning them towards a appropriate missional character of the church. The dialogue of conversion is you'll find in Vatican II texts talking about ecumenism, the recognition that at the heart of the ecumenical discussion, it has to be that personal conversion. John Paul II spoke about this quite a bit, many times that he spoke a bit about ecumenism, but this is where he started, always about that personal dialogue, the personal conversion that is necessary. So when we speak about a dialogue of conversion, we're not talking about we're going to engage in ecumenical dialogue so as to convert the others. That's not what we're talking about here. It's about a dialogue that occurs so that together we can transform that history, that division, into a new understanding, a new way of living out in the future of the church, to live together and to work together in common mission, common ministry. So that dialogue calls us both to internal conversion as well as a conversion of that history, which the healing and memory. So you can see they all sort of intersect together a little bit here. So those are sort of 5 key themes, and they all came out of that one little quote at the beginning of the synod. These are all elements that are also part of the synodal process. It's not just ecumenical work; it's synodal as well, right? So in some ways, when we talk about ecumenism, it's the outward focus of the church towards other Christians, and the synodal discussion is the internal question of how do we govern ourselves as a church. But in fact, they're really two sides of the same thing, right? They're not. We should not be interpreting our relationship with other Christians as outside of the church. Other Christians are part of the church, the whole people of God, the common baptism. Fundamentally, our synodal discussion with one another, as in the broader Catholic world, needs to expand to include the broader Christian community as well, because we are all part of the whole people of God. We can't draw that barrier. It's a false barrier. Okay. One of the key principles and ways in which we address our ecumenical work is something that's called a gift exchange. Canadian theologian Margaret O'Gara, who used to teach at St. Mike's, is now sadly gone, but she introduced this idea in some of her works. It was later included as in Pope John Paul II's encyclical Utinam Sint from 1995. And it's basically the idea that there are gifts. We find this in Vatican II in Lumen Gentium and in the Decree on Ecumenism, that there are gifts that are given, spiritual gifts given to the churches, which are preserved by the churches sometimes more completely in one church than another. And so the part of the ecumenical process, part of the ecumenical impulse is to share those gifts with one another and to learn, to recover, or to renew those aspects of Christian life that we have let atrophy in our own tradition. So we have learned, for example, more about certain kinds of mystical traditions from the Eastern churches. We've learned, we were just talking before we started here about certain poverty of Catholic preaching, and we learn from other Christians about preaching and renew our own preaching. I remember a period about maybe 15 years ago where we had, when I was ecumenical officer in Saskatoon, and we had a visit from some of the evangelical leaders. They wanted to learn about marriage preparation and how we journeyed with couples and to prepare them for marriage. And so we introduced them to our marriage commission, and ended up it's some evangelical lay leaders went through a training process to learn how we did marriage preparation, and they began their own marriage preparation programs, strengthening marriages in their own churches. So this is part of the exchange. The idea that some of these, sometimes we talk about the spiritual gifts, they are more particular things like a reverence for scripture, or there are a number of things that right off the top of my tongue, they're not there right now, but they were part of the list actually mentioned in Lumen Gentium. They mention a number of things, but in fact there are a variety of things that are received. So the idea that there is this gift exchange and that we are learning from one another and rediscovering those from each other. The notion of receptive ecumenism comes from an English theologian, Paul Murray, and it's a building on that gift exchange idea. But he takes it a step further and puts a little bit more enriched. He enriches the theological discussion about it by focusing on the woundedness of the church. So it's problematic to say that the church is divided, that we are actually, when we use that language of division or separation, it actually does not completely accurately describe what's happened. If we recognize that we share a common baptism, that we are part of the same people of God, then of course we have a problem with talking about division and separation. So he uses the language of woundedness, recognizing that the church has been wounded by in our history, by certain things that have happened in history, and that our task is to heal those wounds. He speaks about those gifts of the Spirit that have been formed and molded by our particular history and theology. But in that woundedness, the churches have developed ways of life that are impaired because of the separation from other churches. We are impaired. We have lost something because of our separation, not just because in our own history we haven't done so well in this certain aspect of our life, or mystical understanding, whatever, but we've actually lost something because of the lack of relationship with the other. And that woundedness is something that needs to be healed. He typically English uses this image of fine china. He says it's fine china that's been cracked and chipped by a lifetime of use. Our ecclesial gifts show those signs of wear. And he says we should not come to the dialogue with our finest china, but instead with the cracks and chips of our daily use. And this is a wonderful image. I recently was part of a group, or it was somebody was wanting to present their, wonderful, beautiful liturgy that is not our normal liturgy. This is not something we use on a daily basis. Why would you do that as your ecumenical demonstration of this is our liturgy? No, don't bring your finest china. Bring your daily use to it. So the idea of receptive ecumenism has been a very rich development in the last 20 years or so of ecumenical discussions. And you will see that coming out, this language coming out in some of the Synod documents as well. Paul Murray has been an advisor to the Synod team, and a number of people that work with him are on the Synod consultors. I'm running. I know I'm going to run out of time, so I'm watching Kathy here to see if I'm getting too close. But so when we talk about,
please don't feel rushed. It's more important that we hear what you have to share, because we're going to keep talking for a long time to come, Nick. So please take whatever time you need to share your wisdom. Thank you. Thank you.
So when we look at the some of the other Christian communities, I want to be careful that we're not engaging in. So I'm not presenting this as an example of comparative ecclesiastics. It's not just looking at this is how they're structured and this is how we're structured and this is, wouldn't it be nice if we had this kind of model? Comparative ecclesiastics has its place, but we don't really do that on a regular basis. That's not really the point. More interesting is what are the theological principles expressed by their practices. So the first one, of course, we want to look at, and we've been hearing a lot about how Orthodox churches have practiced synodality, that this is a key theme. They're probably the only church that would actually use the term or something similar to synodality, that they would understand the conversation that we're having. When we've had this conversation with other churches over the last couple of years, when asking them, so what do you got? What's synodality in your church? They look at you very funny. They don't know what it means, as many Catholics don't know what it means either. But Orthodox do. Orthodox have synods, normally in a geographic region that includes numerous dioceses, normally maybe a whole country. Orthodox are typically organized as national churches or ethnic churches, and so the Synod governs that whole church. So the Church of Greece is separate than the Church of Bulgaria, which is right. Each of those churches has their own Synod. And so the Synod typically comprises bishops and senior clergy. It can include theologians, and they have a tradition of lay theologians. So lay theologians have been part of synods as well. But generally, it's not a synod made up of laity. It's primarily the clergy. The word sobor may be familiar to some of you. It's a Slavic term which is used to describe their synod. So it's in the Slavic Orthodox churches that this was a commonly used word. Sobornost is a term which is similar to what we mean by synodality. Is that sort of the attitudes of living within the sobor. But it was also the same. Sobornost is the word that they use when they translate the Nicene Creed into and it's so when we profess one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, it's instead of Catholic, it's sobornost. So Catholicity is the notion of Catholicity is sort of a synonym almost for synodality. So think about what we mean by Catholicity and the embracing of the fullness and wholeness of the wider tradition and of the whole community. That is an element of synodality. Russian theologian Alexei Khomiakov used sobornost as togetherness, the unity in multiplicity. he understood that the church reflecting the life of the Holy Trinity, that it in many of our sort of the last 35, 40 years, discussions in ecclesiology have focused on this notion of koinonia, a communion ecclesiology. Sometimes in a Eucharistic terms, we will also, but the term koinonia is sometimes translated as communion or fellowship or something like that. That's the Greek term, but in the Russian, there's more of a reference in the Sobornost, so that our notions of communion are also sort of intersecting with the broader questions of synodality as well. And you'll see in our own synod process, in the sort of three terms that are used in they talk about communion, participation, and what was the third term as part of the synod office?
Mission.
Pardon, Mark?
Mission.
Thank you very much. Yes. So communion and participation are two different ways within the Eastern or within Orthodox theology of looking at that understanding of koinonia, and so in Komiakov Sobornost. So it's there's a rich theological exploration to continue there. Amongst Anglicans, they have synods within their diocese. Actually, their synodal system has actually only developed in the last century and a half. The Church of England has had what later became the General Synod of the Church of England was the third House of Parliament. So besides the House of Commons and the House of Lords, they have the church, what we used to be called the Convocation. And of course, it's also under royal leadership and the governance, but so they need, but it functioned as a legislative body in which both the bishops and the priests and laity all participated in the convocation, and that has been become the General Synod. Has been it's still within the parliamentary system that they still require decisions of the General Synod of the Church of England still require the assent of the Crown. And the appointment of bishops is, because it's an established church, the appointment of bishops requires the recommendation of the Prime Minister and the appointment by the Crown. So there's this idea that the synodal system within the Church of England is highly integrated with the nature as an established church. But other Anglican churches around the world, where they are not established, continue to have the synodal system. Within each diocese, the bishop gathers the senior clergy, or a certain number of clergy and a certain number of lay people now, and the synod makes deliberation. There's a parliamentary process, and certain things are decided there as legislative acts, which then come to the bishop for assent. So it is both the certain things that have to be decided by the synod; they cannot be decided by the bishop alone, and when the synod does make a decision, they do require the assent of their bishop. So there's this relationship between them. There are strengths to this, in this idea that all voices are represented. There are, as I said, there's lay people and clergy and bishop and the bishop in the diocesan synod, and at the General Synod, at the national level, they actually function as three houses of the synod. So there's the House of Laity, the House of Clergy, which is the priests, don't know if deacons get to go to General Synod. And they have, and then the House of Bishops, and they actually vote separately. So some things require the assent of all three houses in order to be passed. So there's that representation of all, and presumably an equal opportunity to be heard. But it's also important to build the relationships, not only within those houses, but between the different orders. There's also a challenge with that. People have to understand the issues. They have to act. If you're going to engage in that discernment process, you need to know what's going on. You need to understand the theological issues and the other issues. There's also, and this has become more and more the case, that sort of a professionalization of clergy leads to laity tending to defer to them. There's also, there's always those people who know the rules of order and all of the other documents, and they've been there longer or whatever, and they tend to dominate the process. And this is true in all of the churches that have these systems. That they struggle with that. It's very difficult for people to learn the system and to become to engage at the same level. So Mennonites. These are each examples of different churches, but of course the structures of the Episcopal model, the congregational model that Mennonites have, and next I'll look at Presbyterians, which is I'll explain that when we get to it. So Mennonites are an example of a congregational model. Here, where the principal expression of church is in the local, the church at a larger level is simply the connection of all of the local congregations. They don't speak about a universal church. The language that Catholics would focus on, both a local and universal, is simply does not make sense from the Mennonite perspective. Their congregational polity, meaning that each congregation is self-governing and responsible for itself. They're autonomous, which means that they will actually they make decisions that are not reviewable elsewhere. If they decide to do something, even on doctrine, that is different than their conference, their conference can do the only thing the conference can really do is decide to expel them. That's the only thing, and it's unlikely to do that unless it's on something that they consider to be very central. A conference is not legislative, it's advisory. If the legislative acts happen at congregational level. This gets complicated when you talk about things like clergy abuse and things like that, because how does the denomination exercise oversight of the clergy? When clergy it's hard for a congregation to do that. So frequently the denomination does have to step in, and there are times when that sort of has led to some conflict with the congregational polity, and that sort of struggles, not just with Mennonites, but many Congregationalist churches. This is the same problem. For Mennonites, a lot of this comes from their Anabaptist focus on the believer's baptism so their understanding of entry into Christian discipleship and membership in the church comes in that adult baptism and that profession of faith. So the church itself is the people gathered in the common profession of faith and public witness. It's not some institution that stands separate from the people, or stands separate from the profession of faith. So Mennonites are also a peace church, and this shapes the way that they order their life together. The idea is that they are to be living as a peaceful kingdom. The church seeks to be engaged in social healing, restorative justice, and other healing of memories. Reference that I made before is a term that Mennonites have emphasized a lot in the ecumenical discussions. So Presbyterians. They would be the Scottish expression of Calvinism, or the Reformed movement in the 16th century. it's particularly different than the rest of the Calvinist traditions. The Scottish formed this model of church governance in which they are sort of governed at a regional level rather than the congregational or as episcopal bishop governed by bishops. They're governed by their presbytery. The presbytery is made up of all of the ministers in that region, plus an equal number of elders. And so ruled by elders is what they mean by Presbyterian, presbyter meaning elder. So there are really two kinds of elders. There are what they call the teaching elders, who are the ministers, and there are ruling elders. And some people like to say, well, the teaching elders are the ordained ministers and the ruling elders are these lay people, but actually they ordain them all. The ruling, when they elect an elder in the congregation, they then ordain them, and they're considered ordained for life. So a person who moves to another congregation, if they should be elected as an elder there, they will not be reordained. They will simply be installed into that ministry. But they, in some Presbyterian traditions, some churches, they have eldership is for life. In others, they have term eldership. But if they were to be reelected at a later time, they would not be reordained. Ruling elders also don't require any particular formal education or training. They form the church council at that level. There are really four what they call courts of the church. So at the session is the church council or the congregational level, but then the presbytery, synod, and general assembly, and all of them are made up of ruling elders and teaching elders. The minister or the teaching elder in the congregation moderates the session, which is made up of all the ruling elders. But at each of the other levels, there's an equal number of teaching elders and ruling elders. So the idea is that it expresses that participation of lay people. All of this is rooted in the sort of Calvinist understanding of the priesthood of all believers. This is a notion that comes in both Luther and in Calvin in the 16th century, and sort of it's later given expression at the Second Vatican Council in Lumen Gentium, although they don't use the term priesthood of all believers, but that's it's the same idea. So all are called to participate in the governance of the church. And so we can see it's a connection to synodality there. Finally, the last thing I want to talk about is a couple of dialogues. In the Orthodox Roman Catholic dialogue, there are two documents, one in 2016 and one in 2023, that have spoken about synodality and primacy. So primacy is what we would speak about the Pope as the first among equals amongst the bishops. First among equals, or primus inter pares, is actually a term that is also found in the Eastern Church as well, and so there's expressions of primacy in an area where a metropolitan bishop has a responsibility for the other bishops in that area, and where a patriarch has responsibility for the whole church of that group. So primacy has been used primarily in our discussions around the nature about the way that bishops interact with each other and the relationship of the authority that they express. Synodality, though, is of course the synod. In the Eastern tradition of the synods, there's a relationship between how the bishops function in primacy and how the synod functions within the life of the church, and so that they're exploring that idea. So the two documents, 2016 and 2023, really separate it by time period. So the first look at the first millennium, which is the period when East and West were generally in communion. There were a lot of times when we broke communion, and but the 1054 is the nominal date that we talk about the separation between East and West. And so in the first millennium, what we've seen that document in 2016 is an agreement that in a future, when the Church of East and West are in full communion again, that the Western Church will not expect of the Eastern Church anything more than was agreed to in the first millennium. In other words, the practices of the first millennium were sufficient for communion then, and it should be sufficient for communion now. So the high claims of papal authority don't come until the beginning of the 11th century. The idea of the Pope as having ordinary immediate and universal authority, that claim does not come until the 11th century, and that would not. So that agreement is that would not be part of a future full communion with the Eastern Orthodox. The later document, just from last year, explores in further depth the developments in the second millennium, so both documents are really, really good, worth looking at. The Anglican Roman Catholic International Commission is the sort of the most productive of any of the dialogues, actually, and at the international level, and it has produced a document in 2018, which uses that notion of receptive ecumenism that I talked about before. And how do we receive the gifts? But it also, you can tell from the title, Walking Together on the Way, that it's also really an early reflection about synodal life, and how do we walk together as two churches who are separated by that division, but who are growing together, and who have been walking together since the 60s in many ways in common mission around the world. And there are numerous examples in this document of ways that we could be working together in our local churches, encouraging those kind of things. And so it uses synodal language, and it uses that notion of receptive ecumenism. The current text that dialogue is now working on is one related to moral discernment, and how do we deal with the challenges and struggles of differing. Well, it's primarily the discussions over sexuality, but other ethical questions that have arisen in the church, and how, when we have those divisions, how do we resolve those internally and in between churches? And so the question of moral discernment brings us to tools, or brings us to think about those the ways of dialogue and engagement and listening and encounter with the other that is respectful even amongst differences. Their work on that sort of parallels the work from the World Council of Churches. They have a document, three volumes actually, that came out in 2021 about the churches and moral discernment. And this is, once again, because the whole question, not just of human sexuality, but there's a wealth of different ethical issues that seem to be leading to a realignment between the churches. So instead of being divided by, there's Catholics and Orthodox and Anglicans and Lutherans and Reformed and Evangelicals and Pentecostals and all the other, there used to be 12 families in the World Council of Churches. There seem to now be divisions along the lines of conservative and liberal and various other kinds of ways that we interpret those contemporary issues that weren't the issues of the division, but have become division today. And so their reflection is about how do we understand and interpret those new divisions, but also what is the importance of moral discernment. And the first two volumes is an outline of examples from different churches that are members of the World Council of Churches about how they have dealt with moral discernment and challenges within their own traditions. And the third volume is actually a tool for both for use internally to a church, within a church, as they're struggling with disputes over ethical issues, but also for work between churches that are also who have found themselves at odds because of these new divisions over ethics. So, okay, so that brings me to an end of my my reflection. I don't really have a way to sum all this up, but I hope that what you've seen here is that the ecumenical discussions are rooted in the same kind of themes and processes and good practices of listening and dialogue that we're talking about in synodality.